The Arab-Israeli War. From the 1500s to World War I, the Holy Land, an area that roughly covers modern-day Israel, the Palestinian territories and parts of Lebanon, was ruled by the Islamic Ottoman Empire. During that time, the Zionist movement emerged in Europe, which aimed for a Jewish homeland in this region. In the early 1900s, waves of Jews began immigrating there. After World War I, Britain took control of Palestine, Israel and Jordan from the Ottomans. In the Balfour Declaration of 1917, Britain promised its support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. In 1920, mandatory Palestine was established, and in 1922, the League of Nations officially gave Britain the authority to govern Palestine. During British rule, Jewish immigration to the region increased due to rising anti-Semitism in Europe, fueling tensions with local Arabs who opposed the political implications of Zionist ambitions. This led to the 1946-39 Arab Revolt and the 1944-48 Jewish insurgency against British rule. In 1947, the UN proposed partitioning Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, giving 56.5% of the land to Jews, despite them being one-third of the population. Arabs rejected the plan, sparking civil war between the two groups. Britain began withdrawing. In early 1948, Zionist forces launched military operations to secure land for the Jewish state, including territory assigned to Arabs and Jerusalem's international zone. This led to mass Palestinian displacement and events like the Deir Yassin massacre. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared independence as the British mandate in Palestine ended. The next day, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria and Iraq invaded in an attempt to establish a unified Arab Palestine. After a year of fighting, a ceasefire left Israel in control of over two-thirds of historic Palestine, including West Jerusalem. Jordan held East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Egypt took Gaza. Over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled in the aftermath of the war. In the next 3 years, a similar number of Jews arrived in Israel, including 260,000 expelled from surrounding Arab countries. The Suez Crisis. In 1956, Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal to fund domestic projects. Though legal, it angered Britain, which depended on the canal for vital trade. British Prime Minister Eden viewed Nasser as a threat to British interests, and he decided that he would have to go, a view shared by French Prime Minister Guy Mollet, who had an additional reason to want Nasser gone due to France's war in Algeria. Britain and France then secretly coordinated with Israel. On October 29th, Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France issued an ultimatum to both sides, seen as a pretext to intervene. They then attacked Egypt under the guise of restoring order. Egypt's military was quickly overwhelmed and over 1,000 civilians died. The global backlash was swift. The US and USSR condemned the invasion, with Eisenhower threatening Britain and France to kick them out of NATO. The Soviets even threatened to use nuclear weapons against them. Under US pressure, Britain, France and Israel withdrew. The crisis damaged British and French global influence and marked the end of independent imperial policy. Nasser emerged as a hero in the Arab world, boosting pan-Arabism. Israel gained access to the previously blocked Straits of Tiran, though not to the Suez Canal. The Six-Day War was fought in June 1967 between Israel and Egypt, Syria and Jordan. Tensions rose in May when Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, a declared justification for war for Israel. Egypt also moved defensive troops to the border and ordered the UN peacekeepers out. On June 5th, as the UN withdrew, Israel launched surprise airstrikes, which were labeled as preemptive strikes, destroying most of Egypt's air force and gaining air dominance. At the same time, Israeli ground forces invaded Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and Gaza, which Egypt's forces couldn't hold. Jordan, bound by a recent defense pact with Egypt, attacked Israeli positions. Syria joined on day 5, bombarding northern locations. By the end, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. This war caused over 16,000 military deaths. Civilians and peacekeepers also died on both sides, including 34 Americans on the USS Liberty incident struck by Israeli forces by mistake. The war displaced over 300,000 Palestinians and about 100,000 Syrians, deepening the region's refugee crisis. The War of Attrition lasted from 1967 to 1970, mainly between Israel and Egypt, with support from Jordan, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and their allies. After the Six-Day War, no diplomatic progress was made. The 1967 Arab League Summit adopted a three-no's policy: no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations with Israel. Nasser believed only sustained military pressure could force Israel to withdraw from Sinai. Fighting resumed along the Suez Canal with small artillery exchanges and raids. By March 1969, Egypt launched a full-scale war of attrition involving heavy bombardments, air battles, and commando raids on both sides. Conflict ended in August 1970 with a ceasefire. Borders stayed unchanged and no serious peace efforts followed. The conflict caused thousands of casualties on both sides. The Yom Kippur War. Egyptian President Sadat and Syrian President Assad had planned the war since 1972 to reclaim lost territory and boost their domestic standing. Israel, confident in its military strength, did not expect an attack. The conflict started in October 1973 when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. The attacks focused on the Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights, both occupied by Israel. Egypt broke through the Bar Lev line in Sinai while Syria overran Israeli positions in the Golan Heights. The assault initially caught Israel off guard, but they quickly mobilized troops. The US resupplied Israel while the USSR aided the Arab states, raising Cold War tensions. Israel eventually halted the Syrian advance, pushed into Syrian territory, and attacked near Damascus. In the south, Israel crossed the Suez Canal, trapping parts of Egypt's 2nd and 3rd armies. A ceasefire on October 22nd was broken, leading to Soviet threats. US pressures secured a second ceasefire on October 25th, ending the war. The conflict triggered a global energy crisis as Arab states imposed an oil embargo on Israel's allies. Though Israel had military gains, Egypt regained regional pride, and the war pushed all sides toward diplomacy. The war laid the groundwork for the Camp David Accords in 1978, where Egypt recognized Israel in return for the Sinai. Later, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty followed. However, the Palestinian issue remained unsolved. Operation Litani began in March 1978 when Israel invaded southern Lebanon up to the Litani River in response to the Coastal Road massacre committed by Palestinian militants from Lebanon, where 38 Israeli civilians died. The goal was to create a security buffer zone in southern Lebanon to stop cross-border attacks. The operation resulted in around 2,000 Lebanese and Palestinian deaths, 20 Israeli deaths, and displaced up to 250,000 people in Lebanon. The IDF forced the PLO to withdraw from the area. In reaction, the UN Security Council called for Israel's withdrawal and established the UN Interim Force in Lebanon. The Lebanon War began on June 6, 1982, when Israel invaded southern Lebanon following ongoing cross-border attacks between the PLO and Israeli forces. The trigger was an assassination attempt on Israel's UK ambassador by the Abu Nidal group, which Israel blamed on the PLO. Israel aimed to stop PLO attacks, destroy its presence in Lebanon, and install a pro-Israel Christian government. Israeli forces overran PLO positions, clashed with the Syrian army, and besieged Beirut. With US mediation, the PLO agreed to a ceasefire and evacuated to Tunisia. Israel sought a peace treaty, but installed Lebanese President Bashir Gemayel, who supported Israel, was assassinated. Shortly after, Lebanese Christian militias, allowed by the IDF, massacred over 2,000 Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, sparking global outrage. This led to mass protests in Israel and the resignation of Defense Minister Sharon and IDF Chief Eitan. The conflict left over 20,000 dead, mostly civilians, and sparked the rise of Hezbollah, which continues to fight Israel today. The First Intifada, which began in December 1987 in the Jabalia refugee camp, was a Palestinian uprising against Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It was sparked by the death of 4 Palestinian workers in a traffic incident involving an Israeli truck. Rumors of a deliberate intent spread as a response to the killing of an Israeli in Gaza days earlier. Initially marked by general strikes, civil disobedience, tax refusal, and boycotts, the movement escalated into widespread unrest. Protesters threw rocks and Molotov cocktails, while Israel deployed up to 80,000 troops in response. The crackdown, including the frequent use of live ammunition, drew international criticism. Over the course of the 6-year uprising, more than 1,000 Palestinians lost their lives. Israeli casualties included around 160 deaths and thousands injured. Intra-Palestinian violence also surged, with hundreds accused of collaboration with Israel executed by fellow Palestinians. The uprising severely impacted Israel's economy, especially tourism and agriculture, and marked a turning point in global attention to the conflict, ultimately paving the way for the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, which established a Palestinian Authority for limited self-rule. The Second Intifada erupted in late September 2000 after Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, seen by Palestinians as provocative amid the collapse of peace talks at the Camp David summit earlier that year. Although the visit itself was non-violent, the protests that followed were met with force by Israeli police, resulting in over 100 Palestinian deaths in the opening weeks. The situation quickly escalated into a prolonged and bloody conflict. Palestinian militants carried out around 138 self-detonated attacks targeting Israeli civilians, alongside frequent shootings and rocket attacks. In response, Israel launched extensive operations, airstrikes, assassinations, and incursions into West Bank cities. The 5-year conflict left around 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis dead, and caused dozens of fatalities among foreign nationals. Civilian casualties were high on both sides. Another outcome was the construction of the West Bank barrier by Israel. Hostilities ended with the 2005 Sharm el-Sheikh summit, where Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas committed to halting the violence. Operation Cast Lead, or the First Gaza War, began on December 27, 2008, after a 6-month ceasefire between Hamas and Israel broke down. Tensions reignited following an Israeli raid into central Gaza on November 4th to destroy a tunnel, during which several Hamas fighters were killed. Israel claimed the operation was a preemptive strike to prevent kidnappings. Hamas saw it as a breach of the truce and responded with rocket fire. The conflict opened with intense Israeli airstrikes on Hamas targets in densely populated areas across Gaza. Palestinian groups retaliated with more rockets and mortar fire aimed at civilian areas in southern Israel. In January 2009, Israel launched a ground offensive and began operations in urban centers, facing stiff resistance from Hamas fighters. The fights lasted until January 18th, when a ceasefire was declared. The conflict resulted in around 1,000 Palestinian and 13 Israeli fatalities. Over 46,000 homes were destroyed in Gaza, displacing more than 100,000 people. Both Israel and Hamas were accused of war crimes, and the UN Human Rights Council demanded that Israel repair parts of the damage. Operation Pillar of Defense was an 8-day Israeli military campaign launched in the Gaza Strip in November 2012, triggered by an assassination of Ahmed Jabari, the chief of Hamas's military wing. The operation followed a period of escalating cross-border violence, including over 100 rockets fired into Israel. Israel stated the operation's goal was to stop rocket fire from Gaza and weaken militant infrastructure. In response, Hamas and other militants launched hundreds of rockets striking Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Throughout the conflict, Israel struck over 1,500 targets in Gaza. A UN report estimated over 100 Palestinian casualties. 8 alleged collaborators were executed by Hamas during the fighting. On the Israeli side, 6 people were killed and many injured. The conflict ended on November 21st with an Egypt-brokered ceasefire. Both sides declared victory. Human Rights Watch later accused both Israel and Palestinian factions of violating international laws of war. While many Western governments defended Israel's right to self-defense, countries like China, Iran, and Turkey condemned the Israeli offensive. Operation Protective Edge, or the 2014 Gaza War. After the abduction and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank by Hamas-affiliated militants in June 2014, Israel's response killed 10 Palestinians. After one of its militants died by an Israeli airstrike at the end of June, Hamas started new rocket attacks on Israel. This triggered a 7-week-long conflict between the two sides. On 8th of July, Israel launched airstrikes on the Gaza Strip to halt rocket fire and destroy cross-border tunnels used by militants. On July 17th, the operation expanded into a ground invasion. Eventually, a ceasefire was announced in August. During the conflict, Palestinian factions fired over 4,000 rockets at Israel, with several misfiring within Gaza. In total, the war killed over 2,200 people, mostly Palestinians in Gaza, while 66 Israeli soldiers and 6 civilians in Israel also died. The destruction in Gaza was extensive, with tens of thousands of homes destroyed. The 2021 Israel-Palestine crisis was sparked by East Jerusalem eviction protests and intensified when Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound on 7th of May, injuring hundreds of Palestinians with rubber bullets and stun grenades. In response to the unrest, Hamas issued an ultimatum demanding Israeli withdrawal from the mosque compound. When this was ignored, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched rockets into Israel targeting civilian areas. Israel responded with intense airstrikes on Gaza, striking 950 targets, including schools, hospitals, and the densely populated Al-Shati refugee camp. Over the course of the conflict, thousands of Palestinian rockets were fired at Israel, 90% intercepted by the Iron Dome. Over 200 people lost their lives. Despite calls for de-escalation, including a ceasefire offer from Hamas, Prime Minister Netanyahu initially rejected it. The violence concluded with a ceasefire on May 21st. The ongoing Gaza war began on October 7, 2023, when Hamas-led militants launched a large-scale surprise attack on Israel, leaving over 1,000 people dead, mostly civilians, and taking 251 hostages, aiming to pressure Israel into releasing Palestinian prisoners. In retaliation, Israel initiated a massive bombing campaign and on October 27th launched a ground invasion of Gaza with the stated goals of dismantling Hamas and rescuing the hostages. The military campaign has included multiple other major operations. Throughout, Israeli forces have targeted Hamas leadership both within Gaza and abroad. Approximately more than 55,000 Palestinians have lost their lives in Gaza, and Israel's blockade has led to a severe humanitarian crisis, cutting off food, water, and aid, with a high risk of famine persisting. Entire cities have been leveled, hospitals destroyed, and by early 2025, vast areas of Gaza were rendered uninhabitable. Nearly all of Gaza's 2.3 million residents and 100,000 Israelis have been displaced. Both Israel and Hamas have been accused of war crimes. The war has triggered a broader regional escalation. Ongoing Israeli-Hezbollah clashes led to Israel invading Lebanon, while the Assad regime in Syria fell amid continued Israeli military operations there. Globally, the conflict has fueled widespread protests demanding a ceasefire and a spike in both anti-Semitic and anti-Palestinian sentiment. As of mid-2025, the war and its wider regional effects continue. The Iran-Israel conflict, long foreshadowed by decades of hostility, escalated into direct open conflict in 2024 and intensified further in 2025. The rivalry, rooted in Iran's post-1979 revolutionary ideology and Israel's strategic opposition to Iran's nuclear ambitions, had historically played through proxy battles, Iran's support for Hezbollah and Syrian involvement, cyber warfare, and covert assassinations. In April 2024, the situation escalated when Israel bombed Iran's consulate in Damascus, killing senior Iranian officials. In retaliation, Iran and its regional allies launched coordinated strikes against Israeli targets, including seizing the Israeli-linked vessel MSC Ares and attacking within Israeli territory. Israel responded with further airstrikes inside Iran and Syria. Tensions reached a new peak with the July 2024 assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, followed by the liquidation of Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr in Lebanon. On October 1st, Iran launched missile attacks on Israel, prompting retaliatory strikes later that month. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a large-scale aerial assault on Iranian soil targeting nuclear sites, missile facilities and key military figures, including IRGC commander Hossein Salami. Iranian state media reported civilian deaths in Tehran and the killing of several nuclear scientists. These strikes effectively ended ongoing US-Iran nuclear negotiations and marked the official start of direct war between the two countries. Israel claimed to have destroyed 30% of Iran's missile launchers and allegedly achieved full air superiority over Tehran. In response, Iran fired missiles and drones at Israeli military bases and cities, which reportedly caused several civilian deaths. Islamic countries like Jordan, Turkey and Egypt denounced the Israeli attacks, as did powers like China, Russia, Brazil and South Africa, citing violations of international law. Western governments, including the US, Germany and the UK, backed Israel's right to self-defense while calling for de-escalation and reiterating opposition to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons.